I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where I speak with creative entrepreneurs, artists, and other insanely interesting people to hear their stories, learn about their molding moments, tipping points, and spectacular takeoffs. In this episode of The Unmistakable Creative, I speak with Mark Russell. Some people come up with projects that truly challenge the status quo. In an attempt to come to terms with his extremely religious upbringing, Mark teamed up with cartoonist Shannon Wheeler to write a comedic translation of the Bible called God is Disappointed in You. Listen in as he talks to me about his journey and his storytelling process. Today's episode of The Unmistakable Creative is brought to you by Selz. That's SELZ.com. If you're looking for an alternative to PayPal that can be used to collect payments for digital products, physical products, and even services, Selz is a fantastic option. There's no programming, no special templates, or special themes needed. And they recently even added the ability to give your customers a pay-what-you-want option. Many of the Unmistakable Creative listeners are already using Selz and absolutely love the product. Mark, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, I came across you by way of our mutual friend, Meg Warden. And the reason I came across you is that she had posted a book called God is Disappointed in You. And when I found out what it was, I thought, I have to talk to this guy. I mean, that sounds completely insane. He wrote a comedic translation of the Bible. Either he's somebody I have to know or he's going to burn in hell, maybe both. I was so intrigued by the art form because it was such an unusual creative endeavor. So, tell me a bit about yourself and your background and your story and how it leads to you waking up one day saying, I have a creative project on my mind, and that creative project is to write a comedic translation of the Bible.
Yeah, well, I grew up in a very fundamentalist Pentecostal household. So in a lot of ways, writing this book it wasn't so much a form of literature as it was a form of therapy. It was kind of coming to terms with the baggage that I had grown up with. But the idea for the project really came about at a bar. A lot of my life happens at bars. I was meeting with Shannon Wheeler, who's a friend of mine, and we were just hanging out. And he just asked me what I happened to be up to lately. And I said, I've been taking a few books of the Bible and condensing them down to like a few paragraphs each so I can, tell friends what they're about. Because I had a lot of friends who'd never grown up with the Bible. And like yourself, were curious, but never really had grown up with it. So out of the blue, he says, well, you should do the entire Bible and I'll draw cartoons for it and we'll have a book. And it never occurred to me before to actually turn this into a whole book project. So that's where the project was born.
So what's your background? I mean, are you a writer by training? What leads up to that moment? I'm always curious as to you mentioned the religious household, but what else? Like, how do you get to this conclusion?
Yeah, well, I've been toiling in obscurity for a long time as a writer and cartoonist, and I've published. I used to publish my own zine called The Penny Dreadful back in the 90s and early 2000s. And I've also been published other places like McSweeney's. And I did some novellas about Superman, which is where Shannon kind of met me because he really liked my little Superman novellas. And I think he was just eager to work together at some point after that. And, Shannon Wheeler is like one of my favorite cartoonists in the world. So when he offered, I couldn't very well say no.
Well, talk to me about the earlier part of your career. I think that the idea, I had a woman named Dani Shapiro here, and she was telling me how working artists were something that she wasn't exposed to until late, the idea that, hey, these books that you read and these movies that you watch are actually produced by people who make a living making them. And so, I think that's like we kind of say, okay, those are the careers for the hippies or the people who just happen to get damn lucky. You better go to school and do something practical. I'm very curious about the earlier part of your journey and the things that have led to you becoming a writer. Like, what did that look like? And you mentioned a zine, you mentioned Superman. Like, talk to me about some of these projects in a bit more depth.
Yeah, well, I think there's a big difference between a working artist and an earning artist. I've always been a working artist in that I've always really poured a lot of myself into my writing projects. This is the first one I've actually stood to make really any money off of.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, I started publishing my short fiction and cartoons in a zine called The Penny Dreadful here in Portland. And it was really just kind of things that I felt weren't really right for anywhere else, things that were just too odd
Mm-hmm.
or short or idiosyncratic to really send off to any place with any sort of realistic hope of publication. And I had a day job. I still have a day job, but this was always my passion. This is what I did on my own time, whenever possible. And I put together a couple of novellas about Superman, and in a way, all of my writing life has been a kind of an attempt to come to terms with my with my religious upbringing. And even in the Superman novellas, God shows up and introduces himself to Superman and tells Superman that he's kind of the son he'd wished he'd had. Instead, he got stuck with this sort of feckless hippie in the form of Jesus. And at one point, he actually sends Jesus to go live with Superman, hoping that Superman will rub off on him. But things do not kind of go as planned. And I'm actually, now that the Bible book is done, I'm back to working on the Superman novellas, and I'm hoping to get them rewritten as one big novel.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's actually a lot of stuff here that's really interesting. The notion. Well, I love one that you mentioned, that you still have a day job. That's really cool to me. Like, I think that is something that people need to get their head around, because by the time you guys are listening to this, we'll have kind of beat this idea like a dead horse. But the internet has perpetuated this mantra of quit your job, go be awesome, be the 4-hour work week guy, and all this nonsense, which is not realistic for a lot of people. But yeah. I love that this is actually normal for you. Like, you have a normal job, but you're still you're still an artist.
Yeah, and I know a fair number of people who who make their living from their art.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, they spend a lot of that time not creating art. They spend a lot of that time worrying about money, doing things to pay the bills, chasing a lot of engagements and checks to so really the time I would be able to save by not having a day job would pretty much be consumed by all the other song and dance numbers you have to do to earn a living as an artist.
Mm-hmm.
So I figured, well, I'll just stick with the day job and then just write on my own time, and I can really devote that time to writing and my artwork, and I don't have to worry about doing all these other things to pay the bills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's actually, it's funny, because that's really not a part of the conversation that happens when you listen to a show like this, or the conversation around the web, especially for so many of you who are connected to me on Facebook and to some of our guests on Facebook. If you look at the news feed, it's like, wow, nobody does anything. Like nobody. It seems like none of us are in day jobs, and everybody's living these epic lives. But I think you bring up a really a critical distinction to really understand that, hey, you know what comes with the territory of earning your living from an art is a lot of things that are pretty inconvenient and not that comfortable.
Yeah, and really, it's kind of like living on the Serengeti or something. You have no idea when you're going to get the next check.
Yeah.
There could be a drought, and all of a sudden, you're going 2 or 3 months living on peanut butter until you get another paying gig. It's not a lifestyle that appeals to me. I like the steady paycheck and
mm-hmm.
being able to take hot showers and go out to eat and see movies. These sort of creature comforts I've come accustomed to.
Yeah, but so here's actually, let's dig deeper into this. I mean, here's the thing: you've done that, but somehow you haven't let go of this desire to create art. Like, you still embrace the fact that there is an artist within inside of you. And then I see so many people who are like, oh, well, I don't have time, or I actually I had a reader from the Art of Being Unmistakable who wrote into me, and he said, "There's no point doing this or creating any art if nobody's gonna consume it or I don't get paid for it." And I said, you missed the entire point of the book.
Yeah, I've spent 10 years basically cranking a zine out of my basement. Mm-hmm. Hardly anybody read it, but I don't think that was. I mean, I wanted people to read it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not too cool for attention by any stretch of the imagination. But it wasn't really what drove me. I just had these ideas and I had to get them out. Otherwise, I just wouldn't feel right about myself unless I expressed them. I think that to really embrace it as a lifestyle, you've got to like be willing to do it regardless of what sort of compensation you get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's it's funny because people see, especially with the internet, it perpetuates this notion that, hey, if I make art, I'm going to become famous. And I can tell you, I had a lot of those very similar motivations in the early days of dabbling. It was like, oh, hey, maybe I'll start a blog and get a book deal. And, nobody came to me with a book deal.
It's because you only ever hear about the winners.
Yeah.
The only people I ever hear about who bought a lottery ticket are the people who win the Powerball. I don't hear about the other 10 million people who blew the rent money on it.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. I think that's there's something to be said for that, to make art for the sake of making art. I always say that it's like art that rewards its creator long after the average person would quit. It's something that's admired, but it's not encouraged.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that art is just something you do because you feel the need to find your connection to the bigger connection to the bigger universe around you, mm-hmm. and the art as a career is just something that happens if you're lucky.
Yeah. No, I would agree. So let's do this. Let's talk specifically about sort of the craft of storytelling. I mean, the Superman novellas sound fascinating to me. I mean, as somebody who primarily writes nonfiction, I always admire people who can craft, characters and build storylines around things that literally starting from nothing. I mean, I think it's very easy to write nonfiction in comparison to writing fiction or to storytelling that. So I'm really curious, I mean, you have the blank page. How does something like a Superman novella come to life for somebody like you?
Well, and it started when I was watching one of those old George Reeves TV shows, and I kept thinking, this is absurd. If I were Superman, there's a guy who breaks into a bank dressed in a robot costume and, befuddles the police. It's like, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard of, because once Superman shows up, he doesn't know that you're a guy stuck in a robot costume. He's just going to think you're a robot. Mm-hmm. He's going to tear your arm off. He's going to knock your head off, not knowing that there's an actual man trapped inside. And in fact, that happens in one of my novellas. He comes upon what he thinks is a robot and just demolishes it, only to find out there was it was just a costume, and there's a burglar inside posing as a robot whom he's killed. But a lot of it then after that kind of dealt with Superman having these enormous powers, but just having an average brain, which, mm-hmm. Incredibly dangerous combination. He could destroy the entire world in 5 minutes, and yet he's just as prone to like throwing a fit and having a bad day as anyone else. It really kind of has become a meditation on the consolidation of power. And in a lot of ways, I realized after writing the first couple that he is in many ways kind of a stand-in for the United States after the Cold War. He's got no real counterpart, no reason to have all this power. Nothing challenges him. Somebody stands up to him or, defies him, and he will demolish them in 10 minutes and then have, rest of his day to go have breakfast with Lois and, go to pep assembly or do all these other things, because nobody comes even remotely close to being able to challenge him. So he finds these very petty ways to channel his power. And it's not good for the people around Superman, because any little thing he does could, to save somebody, can kill 5 other people without him even knowing about it. And it's not good for Superman because he feels constricted, because he feels like people are so fragile compared to him. If he skips a rock into the ocean, it could sink an ocean liner, 10 miles away. And mm-hmm. he can't. It feels like every time he turns around, somebody's going to die.
So it's really interesting to hear you talk about like the way you develop characters, the way you tell stories. I want to go back actually to something you said in the earlier part of our conversation, and then I really want to spend a lot more time talking about God is disappointed in you, which, for those of you guys listening, that's the name of the comedic translation of the Bible. And I know some of you are probably going to send me hate mail after this, but I felt Mark's. What I wanted to find out was the art, about the art behind this, because I felt it was quite interesting. But Mark, what I'm really, curious about is, I mean, you mentioned the religious childhood and the fundamentalist childhood, but I mean, what kinds of influences did you have as a child, when it comes to art? I mean, knowing that, hey, you know what, maybe I'm not going to make a career as an artist, but it's clear that there's this undertone of, hey, I am a creative person throughout your life from everything I'm hearing. And I'm very curious what it was like growing up in a household where it seems like there's almost two conflicting sort of ideals.
Yeah, my cultural exposure as a kid was very minimal. In our house, our books were primarily religious in nature. I did have a Snoopy science textbook, which I really enjoyed, but most of the literature was Christian, or were meditations on the Bible, or were Bibles themselves. I think we had like 5 or 6 Bibles when I was a kid. uh, so. I think my cultural exposure mostly came through television and cartoons. And I think that, and jokes, and I loved jokes. I owned probably I had a library of joke books when I was a kid. And I think the joke, more than anything, is the literary form that has kind of infused its way into my soul. Like, even now when I write serious fiction, it kind of follows the same pattern as a joke.
Uh-huh.
For me, storytelling is joke telling, in that you have like this sort of unusual premise, and then you build up to like this sort of question, and then you answer it in a completely unexpected way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that like, now that you're describing it, I mean, I've read half the book, and it pretty much, that doesn't surprise me in the least. So let's do this. Let's shift gears a little bit, and let's start getting into sort of, I mean, you one is surrounding yourself with a working artist, like having a cartoonist like Shannon Wheeler, how you connect with somebody like this, like where that happens in all of this. I mean, how did that come into play? But did you you said you were condensing these stories from the Bible down, but I mean, did you just wake up one day and think, hey, you know what, I have to do this, like, and not only that, I have to make it a comedic translation. And then I remember my favorite thing when I read the book jacket, or the back cover, I was like, oh, the arcane language of the Bible translated into something that, you can actually understand. And I thought, well, good, this is great. Now I actually want to read it.
Yeah. Well, for me, I got started just because I had friends who were Bible curious, had no background in the Bible, and just wanted to know. And they knew that I had grown up with this uber religious childhood, so they asked me, and so I just got in the habit of kind of relaying like the book of the book of Job is a crazy bet between God and Satan, and I would just surmise them in these ways. And I think the really down to earth and comedic tone of it is just kind of the way I like to talk to people. It's just kind of the way I relate to people. So that was very organic. In terms of doing the Bible, I realized when I started doing the project that I didn't know the Bible nearly as well as I thought I did. That what I had learned from my childhood was actually the 1% of the Bible that is useful to teach kids in church, to keep them from smoking or wanting to have sex with anybody. But I didn't learn anything about the other 99% of the Bible, which is really where a lot of the actual value of the Bible is, and it's the part of the cantaloupe you never eat right next to the rind that you get all the best, nutritional value. And that's the same way with the Bible. The minor prophets, I thought, some of them were just extraordinary. And there's all kinds of great little tidbits in the Jewish histories that many of which we never even read in church. Mm-hmm. And I saw my mission then as to take this incredibly dense and hard to understand matter. And there's books of the Bible where there's 13 chapters of animal husbandry. And you got to like wade through it somehow to get to like the one verse which makes sense of the entire book. So what I wanted to do was just take the books at their own, at face value, and strip them of the sort of arcane language and the innocentia, and then retell the Bible as though I were talking to somebody at a bar.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I love this. So there's so much here. I do want to get into the reactions from the people, but would you mind conveying one of the stories in the way you've told it? Because I think that to me is really the essence of what you're talking about here. And that's immediately to my mind as you were talking about that. I said, I need to have you tell one of these stories so that people can get a sense for how you've taken something. Because I'm sure there are a lot of people here listening who have actually read the Bible.
Yeah, well, one of the books I knew nothing about going into this. This is after spending 18 years in a church, is the story of Hosea. Now, Hosea was a minor prophet, which really is not that bad of a thing. I mean, it sounds kind of diminutive, but the minor prophets were just less talkative than the major prophets. They just got their point across in fewer chapters, which is why we call them the minor prophets, which I think is a good thing. But anyway, Hosea was this prophet whose wife was always cheating on him. And his wife, Gomer, she would always be out, sleeping with whoever was around. And he'd be in this town square preaching, telling people that they need to go back to following the laws of Moses and, upbraiding them for their idolatry and their general lack of enthusiasm for being Jews. And no one would listen to him, though. They were all snickering at him because they knew that while he was preaching, his wife was out sleeping with somebody. And sure enough, when he got done preaching, he'd go home and she wouldn't be there. So he'd have to go find his wife and drag her back home. And everyone would be, laughing at Hosea as they fought in the street. And at one time even, and this had to be the all-time low point of his life, his wife's lover had actually decided to enslave her and then put her up for sale. So Hosea actually had to go to his wife's lover.
So I don't know about you, but vacuuming is not one of those things that I ever look forward to doing. But as you know, your environment has a huge impact on your creativity. So I still like it to be clean wherever I'm living and working. But now it doesn't have to be something that you deal with. If you're like me and you grew up in the 80s, you probably fantasized about the day when cleaning your house would be like it was for the Jetsons, meaning you don't have to lift a finger. Well, the good news is that we're already kind of living in that future. And the easiest way to make sure your floors are clean every day is with the iRobot Roomba Robot Vacuum. It cleans up after itself. The Clean Base automatic dirt disposal takes convenience to a new level, automatically empties its own bin into an allergen lock bag that holds 60 days of debris and traps 99% of pollen, mold, and dust mites so you can forget about vacuuming for months at a time. Let the Roomba clean for you instead. It learns your home, finds dirt, and empties itself on its own. It's got powerful cleaning performance made effortless. Remember, if it's not from iRobot, it's not a Roomba. To learn more, go to irobot.com/unmistakable.
And buy his own wife back from this guy. And he still took her back. And, and she, every time she ran off with some other lover, she'd come crawling back and they'd argue in the street, but every time he'd take her back. And one day he went out to preach in the town square and somebody just worked up the nerve to say, how can you possibly take your wife back after all the times she cheats on you? Why do you not throw her out on her ass? And Hosea just kind of shrugs and he says, well, you know what? My love for my wife is a lot like God's love for us. We're always cheating on God. We're always leaving him for some fleeting pleasure or some new religion. And yet, no matter how ridiculous we make him feel, no matter how much we break his heart, when we come crawling back the next day, he's always willing to take us back. Mm-hmm. And finally, the people understood what he'd been preaching about the whole time.
See, that's why I wanted to have you tell that story. So let's do this. I want to talk about, sort of digesting all of this material down. I mean, really, like I said, I mean, to me, what the real art here is taking something. I mean, it's like you've taken Ulysses and made it understandable for the average human being. And for those of you guys who have never read anything by James Joyce, most of it is kind of incomprehensible unless you're like a genius.
Yeah, that would be quite a boast if I could. I don't think I could do that for Ulysses, but I can handle the Bible.
Yeah, so talk to me about sort of the actual creative process of deciding, hey, this is what's important, this is what I need to leave out, this is what actually matters, and this is how this story is gonna make sense to like the layman like Srini who doesn't know the first thing about the Bible.
Well, my process was pretty much reading the entire book on its own. I read one book at a time, and I would write that book after I read it. Instead of trying to do the whole Bible at once or individual verses at once, because I wanted to really understand what this book was about. And then I would, if need be, I would read ancillary sources, other books about the book. But I really wanted to look at it through the author's eyes. Like, what were they trying to say? Who were they talking to when they wrote this? And then from that, I would find what was really essential. And I would basically just convey that as simple as possible. And then I would add back in details like dialogue or little scenes or little things that happen along the way or just funny observations about what this means. The hardest book to condense for me was the Book of Psalms, which I don't know, you're probably not familiar with that, but it's a book of poetry, actually songs. King David wrote most of them, and King Solomon wrote some, and they were always trying to get into the music business, and they had written hundreds of these songs called Psalms. But how do you condense a book that's just 150 chapters of poetry, basically, 150 different songs? And I had no clue how to condense something so big and something that had no real linear narrative. But then it occurred to me that what the Book of Psalms really is sort of like a greatest hits CD. It's, all of David and Solomon's best songs in one, convenient box set. And so then I just wrote the Book of Psalms like it was like one of these late night ads for an Eagles box set, or something like that. And that really kind of like made the book come to life for me.
So I keep seeing a theme throughout your journey here is that you've sort of pulled from other influences, other art forms, and let them kind of shape how you make what you do and how you put what you do out into the world. And I guess for me the question would be, how do we do that? How do we combine multiple art forms so that we can kind of express our own message or express what we're trying to do? Like what's your advice for people?
Well, I think there's two basic pieces of advice here. One, you've got to have, I think, some affection for what you're writing. You can't write from a completely distanced, dismissive standpoint. Otherwise, it's not going to be very good, and it's not going to feel very authentic. It's just going to feel like you're dissing on whatever you're writing, or that it's two-dimensional. And I really felt that for the Bible. I really wanted to understand what was really meant, and I really wanted to find the parts that I thought were valuable in this book, and to give that to other people. The other part is you've got to learn to sound like yourself. You've got to be honest about the way you think. If I had tried to rewrite the Bible to sound like I was King James, the King James version, or trying to sound like George R.R. Martin writing Game of Thrones, it would have been a disaster. The way I talk to people is very casual, it's very abrupt, and I use pop culture allegories and analogies using the things around me in my everyday life. That's basically the way I communicate with people. So for me, it was just a question of finding what I loved about the Bible and then communicating it through the idioms that I use in my everyday life, just the way I actually speak to people. And I think that's what resonates with people. People want to feel like you're being authentic with them, that you're telling them something important and that you're telling it to them in a sincere manner.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like authentic, I feel like is one of those words that we throw around on the internet, and it's kind of like you don't really understand what it means until you experience it yourself. Either you experience it through somebody who's created something, or you experience it in your own creations. So that brings up actually two questions for me. One is actually around humor. I mean, obviously this book is hilarious. I mean, that's why I couldn't, when Meg sent it to me, I was like, okay, this is awesome. I sat in a coffee shop and I kept reading. And I mean, there were moments when I just laughed out loud. So I guess one question around that is bringing humor into writing, because I feel that humor is sort of one of those universal experiences that it actually transcends every boundary, right? Like it breaks down the barriers of religion, culture, language, race, whatever it is. Like, we all love to laugh, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's a universal human experience. And I'm very curious how, what are there things that we do to cultivate that? I mean, how does that play itself out in your other work? I mean, do you do stand-up comedy for fun on the weekends? I mean, what does this look like for you, and how do we bring that into our work?
Well, I think I've always written in humor, in sort of humorous tone, just because I think it's an easy way to get people to listen who might not otherwise care. Mm-hmm. If you can say something but say it in a way it's funny, you're much more likely going to get somebody to listen to you and to engage with you personally than if you just say what it is you have to say. Mm-hmm. I also think that to me, humor is kind of like a stick of butter, in the sense that I wouldn't want to just eat a stick of butter. But if you're cooking a steak in butter, then it's great. So it can't just be funny. It's got to be, I like things that have substance, but then are kind of also funny. Mm-hmm. But the funniness is just kind of like a flavoring of what you're trying to say.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, right? Because I think that there's a sense of sometimes, you can tell when somebody's trying too hard to be funny, and then they're not.
Or, if it's funny, but there's just no substance, there's no point to any of it, mm-hmm. then it's like eating cotton candy to me. Mm-hmm. It's not gratifying.
So one other question around this, and then I want to start getting into sort of the actual, post, the reactions from the world. That's the part that I'm very curious about. I mean, you mentioned working with Shannon Wheeler, who, I know through our correspondence is a cartoonist for The New Yorker, and collaborative processes are always really interesting to me. I mean, I think collaboration as a creative is actually one of the most challenging things to figure out, and to know, okay, this is the person that is meant to, be your collaborator. I mean, I think any of you who listen to our show know, like, Sarah Steenland is our artist, and she is hands down been one of the greatest people to collaborate with, because she gets our world and she gets us. And I think that's always an interesting issue, because there's personalities that have to come into play, but then there's also, creating sort of this cohesion almost creatively between the words and the illustrations. And I'd love for you to talk to us about that process.
Yeah, well, Shannon was a great collaborator, because I think me and him have a very similar sense of humor. And he's also very easygoing. Mm-hmm. So I never worried about offending him, and I never was offended by anything he said. But typically what we would do is I would write a book, and then I would take it to him. And I had condensed this book of the Bible down to maybe 2 or 3 pages, and then he would have to condense my 2 or 3 pages down to a single panel. So he had a really hard job as far as that goes. But I think it worked well with his talents, because he's very much about just getting right to the core of a joke, cutting out everything that's extraneous. And I think in that way he was a very good influence on me, in that I would take a book to him, he would draw a cartoon that was just really essential and really short and sharp. And in a lot of ways, I would write knowing that that I had to be as short and sharp in my dialogue and what I was writing to give him a fighting chance to draw something from that down into a single panel. Mm-hmm. But he would make comments about the books, and I would make comments about the cartoons, and sometimes he'd change his captions based upon my feedback, or sometimes I'd change the way I had written something based on his feedback. So it was very much an active collaboration. And, plus, we drank a lot of beer, and just had a lot of great conversations about the Bible during the course of our collaboration.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, collaboration is always always interesting. I'm always curious about this process, because I think that we underrate this, because we've kind of gotten very individualistic in our endeavors. But I mean, I look at what we've been able to accomplish by collaborating with artists, and I think, God, why didn't we do this sooner? Like, it's amazing what we've accomplished as a group of people collectively, as opposed to individually trying to do something. Well, let's do this. Let's actually shift gears and start talking about kind of the world. The response to the world. I mean, you come from a religious family, and you put out a translation of the Bible called "God is Disappointed in You." So, I mean, how did your family react? How did the world around you react? I mean, how does the religious community respond to something like this? I mean, I remember thinking in the book, I think you even wrote in the book, "I hope we don't burn in hell," or something along those lines.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's a good question, because I haven't really spoken to my family about the book, which is very strange to have written a book, and not talk to your mother about it. but I haven't done so because I know I don't think they would be as appreciative of the humor in it as other people are. The religious community as a whole has been very good about it. They really embraced it. I just had a great time doing a reading and talking about the book at the First Christian Church here in Portland, and everyone seemed to really like it. And most of the reviews even from Christian presses have been really good. In fact, my favorite review was written on this one Christian press website, and the guy who wrote the review clearly enjoyed the book, but felt kind of guilty about the fact that he enjoyed the book. It was great. He was just very sincerely struggling with the fact that he liked it so much, and he was very honest about this. And at the end of his review, he said, "I think I know what it is that bothers me about this book. It's that because of this book, non-believers will understand the Bible better than Christians will." Mm-hmm. And to me, that was the most moving, validating thing he could have said about my book.
Wow. It's interesting. I mean, I'd never thought of it that way, but yeah, I mean, that's, like I said, I mean, for me, like, part of the challenge in ever wanting to read the Bible was I would open it up and I would think, what does this mean? It was so difficult to read. It was so troubling to me that I just thought, there's no way I can make any sense of this.
Yeah, the Bible has its own sort of barriers to understanding, largely because a lot of things were included that don't really make sense to modern readers. Mm-hmm. They're written, for a civilization 3,000 years ago, and often not even for the whole civilization, but just for specific audiences. And a lot of that gets lost in translation over time.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really cool because I was expecting, like, when I asked you the question about how did the religious community respond, I was actually very surprised by your response. I think it's actually very cool that you've gotten such a positive reception from them. Like, I would have imagined that people were going to be telling you guys you're both going to burn in hell.
Yeah, that's kind of what I expected too. I expected a lot of blowback. I expected like protests. Well, actually, I was kind of hoping for protests. I thought that great publicity, and this sadly never happened. But yeah, I was prepared for a lot of anger. Mm-hmm. And my nightmares were that it wouldn't be sacrilegious enough to win over the non-believers, and yet it would be sacrilegious enough that all the believers would hate it. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, the opposite seems to have been true, that it's irreverent and unhagiographic enough to appeal to people who've never read the Bible or don't necessarily believe in the Bible, but it's still got enough affection and sincerity to really appeal to people who love the Bible and have grown up in the Christian church. And I think that maybe I just wasn't giving Christians enough credit for being smart and funny.
So a couple of questions. One other question comes from this. I mean, when you went to the publisher, I'm very curious what a conversation like this goes like. I mean, you sit at the table and say, "Hey, we're going to do a comedic translation of the Bible. Are you guys interested in betting on this one?"
Yeah, well, it actually kind of went backwards. This is a very unusual publishing story, but the publishing company approached me,
wow,
and asked me if I would be interested in going with them because they thought the idea was so great. It was Top Shelf Productions, which they primarily do comic books, mm-hmm. but this was really kind of a strange book to put in their oeuvre. But we decided to go with them because they've always done really beautiful production work on every book that they've done, and they're very oriented towards the writing. They have a lot of really great writers in their stable. They publish a lot of Alan Moore's books. They publish a bunch of Jeffrey Brown's books, and just so I felt like I was in really good company by going with them, and I felt like they would handle it well.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this. I mean, do you see this becoming like, I mean, if I were a kid in school and you handed me the Bible and you handed me God is disappointed in you, I think it's pretty safe to know which I would choose.
Yeah.
Do you see this making that kind of an impact in the world? Like, do you think it could replace, like, I don't know, because I never went to Sunday school. And, for those of you guys listening, please, I'm not being offensive. I'm very just curious. Honestly, I mean, could you see this replacing the Bible so that people who, our kids are like, okay, cool. Like, I mean, to me, like I said, until you wrote this book, I'd always been curious, but now I was like, okay, awesome. Now I can read it.
Well, it wasn't so much that I wanted this to replace the Bible.
Sure.
But I definitely was hoping that somebody would pick up my book, read it, and say to themselves, oh, that can't possibly be in there. And then go grab a Bible and read it and read the passage for themselves. So I don't know if I want it to replace the Bible, but
Sure.
I definitely think that people are better off reading this book first. In fact, we spoke to a few hotels about getting rid of their Gideon Bibles and putting our book in the hotel rooms. So far, no takers, but eventually, I hope that somebody does that.
Wow. I hope somebody, hey, if any of you listening to this own a hotel,
Right.
I've always, between you and me, I've always thought, I'm like, considering what happens in hotel rooms, I've always thought it was very strange that the Bible is in the drawer.
Yep. That's precisely why the Bible's in there, in hopes that you're going to, come to Jesus on prom night. Never going to happen, though.
Yeah, seriously. Well, Mark, you know what? I don't have a ton more questions for you. I mean, this has just been fascinating. I wanted to have you on the show because this was such a sort of distinctive creative endeavor that caught my attention. But, I think it's really cool that you're somebody who has a day job and yet you've produced an art form that clearly is making its way out into the world, impacting people, reaching people. And, my hope is that listening to you really inspires people to tap into that. And I'm very curious, we'll wrap with two questions. One, we kind of asked at the beginning, but kind of, the person sitting in their cubicle with that weird, crazy art project on their mind that seems completely unrealistic, that they can't see how it's going to come to life. I mean, what advice do you have for them?
Take your time. Just do it on your own time. Get it right. The fact that you have a day job and you're not working against a deadline actually works in your favor. Mm-hmm. You can take your time. You can do whatever you want with that project. Just do your best to keep your two parts of your life separate, not to let work bleed over into your personal life and drain the energy from your artwork,
I love that. I think that's fantastic. So one final question for you, and this is, I jokingly say I finally figured out how to close the interviews with a different question after hundreds of interviews when I was asking the same one, but it's kind of a similar question. But, in a world full of noise, how do you become unmistakable?
Wow, I'm not even sure I understand that question, but I'll take a crack at it. I think you become unmistakable because you are willing to be honest you're willing to be honest enough to be wrong about the world.
I love that.
You're willing to take a chance, even though you might be full of shit.
Well, I guess that's the story of The Art of Being Unmistakable in my book. I was willing to take a chance, even though there are people who think I'm full of shit.
Yeah, that's basically it.
Well, hey, Mark, this has been really, really fun. I'm so glad that Meg connected the two of us.
Yeah, me too. I had a great time.
Yeah, and I can't thank you enough for joining us and sharing some of your insights with our listeners here at the Unmistakable Creative. And for those of you guys who honestly, if you haven't read the Bible and you're looking for a sort of entertaining way to read it, the book is called God is Disappointed in You. Meg sent it to me, and you guys have heard our interview with Meg. You know that she has good taste, so definitely recommend it. And we'll wrap the show with that. Today's episode of The Unmistakable Creative has been brought to you by Selz. That's SELZ.com. Selz gives you the freedom to sell from any website quickly with no programming, no special templates or special themes needed, while giving your customer a completely seamless experience. You've been listening to The Unmistakable Creative Podcast. Visit our website at unmistakablecreative.com and get access to over 400 interviews in our archives.